Excellencies, Pan-European friends, former speakers, moderators, thank you very much for coming Sunday morning. Today is the closing moment, it's the closing day, and I'm very, very much proud that you're here also to listen to the last panel that I really thank you, Anna, for organizing, because it's very much interesting, and I believe that is the right one to conclude our 3-day session here under the auspices of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the European Parliament and of the European Commission inside the project Europe for Citizens. I know then I have to say that. So everything is recorded for the European Commission. We have 3 very much distinguished guests today in the morning. Just feel this session very much as a friend discussion, an open discussion. So I also appeal on the moderator and on the speakers to maintain this friendship and openness to the audience, because we would like really to have a real touch by the field about the cooperation with the national diplomacy. Given that here we have today an Excellency, the Ambassador of Netherlands, Mr. Langenberg. So I ask currently if you can join us to the stage. And of course, the team leader, the Northern and Central Europe team, Europe Directorate, Foreign and Commonwealth Officer from London, Mr. Ketley Williams. Thank you very much for coming. Leon Marc, Ambassador and Deputy Secretary General at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Republic of Slovenia, and of course, our member of the Pan-European movement, Anna Petric, High Representative of the Republic of Slovenia for Succession Issues. Thank you very much for coming. Let's enjoy and have a good time. Thank you. Just for the microphone, I advise you, please, as closer as possible.
Okay, like this. Well, thank you very much, Laris. I would also like to thank all the guests who came to this event on a Sunday morning. I know it's not a very convenient timing, but as I think I can promise that together with the panelists, we will try to make this discussion as interesting and enriching as possible on this morning. Well, the European foreign policy was at the focus of this 3 days conference led by the Slovenian Pan-European movement. And today we will try to elaborate on its connectivity or its collaboration with the national diplomacy, so with the foreign policies of its European member states. I would dare to say that the selection of panelists today is quite a perfect combination. We will hear the views of one of the biggest and most influential member states, the UK, and their views on how this collaboration looks like in practice and how this collaboration could be enhanced. Then we will also hear the aspects of the representative of Netherlands, let's say a middle-sized European state, but with a very strong pro-EU tradition. And then lastly, we will turn to a small diplomacy like Slovenia, and we will look at the benefits and, of course, the dangers of a small national diplomacy in the common European foreign policy making. Maybe for the introduction, I would also like to say that we are all representative of respective foreign ministries. However, we will today speak in our own capacity, not as representative of the ministries, but I think that we will be able to give you an insight into this more practical aspect of collaboration. We are all working daily in this relation, capital, Brussels, and in this coordination of common positions and common strategies. And I think this will be sort of the asset of our today's discussions. Before I give the floor to the panelists, I would like to make a few introductory remarks. You all know that the Lisbon Treaty brought significant changes and, in my opinion, also significant improvements into the European foreign policy making. First of all, it created the post of the High Representative of the EU Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. And just looking at the mandate of the High Representative, we can see how this interconnectivity between the EU foreign policy and the positions of national policies of member states is revealed. High Representative is first of all responsible for the implementation of the EU foreign policy, which is of course adopted at the highest level by the ministers of foreign affairs in the Foreign Affairs Councils in Brussels, which she is personally presiding over. She is also, in a limited sense, also the creator of this EU foreign policy at the same time. If we look at her mandate, she can, of course, present proposals and actions to the foreign ministers, and also she's the one who expresses EU positions towards third states, and she's the one who speaks in the name of the EU in the international arena. How huge this activity is, maybe I can illustrate with the fact that maybe that, let's say, in 2011, High Representative made almost 600 statements and declarations. So this is her capacity, that she's the only one who can speak in the name of the EU on the foreign policy issues. Then another invention of the post-Lisbon period is, of course, the establishment of the European External Action Service. Let's say sort of EU Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Not really, but let's say that we can compare it to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the EU. And together with the establishment of the EEAS, we have witnessed the transformation of the former European Commission's representations into the full-fledged EU delegations in almost all countries of the world and in almost all important international organizations. The role of the EEAS is, of course, in the first place, to assist the High Representative and other European institutions in their dealing with external relations activities. And just by looking at the organization of the EEAS, we can see how this complexity of cooperation and intertwining between the European foreign policy and the national diplomacies is elaborated. First of all, it is the High Representative of the EU who is exercising authority over the EEAS and over all the EU delegations around the world. But at the same time, the employees of this External Action Service and EU delegations are coming from three different players: from the European Commission, from the European Council, and from, of course, the member states of the EU. This necessary reality to include employees from three different players is one of the major problems of the EEAS in becoming a harmonized foreign policy institution. However, at the same time, we must admit that the EEAS was established only, 3-4 years ago, so it is not, we were not given enough time for its full establishment, and I think this is what we're looking for still in the future to come. There are many voices who I think believe that the EEAS has a potential of becoming a world-class diplomacy. We have to admit that the competition is very high for getting the posts, and also if you look at the national diplomats, it is really the most qualified diplomats that have a possibility to be selected into the EEAS, into the EEAS system. In this last 2 days, of course, you heard a lot about the positive examples of the work of the EEAS and the High Representative. Mainly the breakthrough in the Iranian portfolio was mentioned, the reached agreement in the Pristina-Belgrade dialogue was mentioned, and of course these are all examples of good practices of the High Representative and the EEAS. But maybe in this practical aspect, I would like to mention this daily process which is going on between the Brussels and the member states, this daily exercise of looking for common positions and common statements of the European Union in hundreds of different foreign affairs, foreign policy issues. So this is something that is going on in Brussels through numerous council working groups. This is something that goes on in Brussels through the representative of member states in different forums at the highest level in the Forum of Foreign Affairs Council. And of course, this is a process that goes on daily in third countries where the representative of member states gather and propose common positions towards these third states or in international organizations in the framework of the EU delegations, who is chaired by the High Representative. So this is, I think, a process which is quite complicated in a sense, and it is a process that not a lot of EU citizens are aware of. They usually see only the big stories. They see where the EU cannot get a unified voice, like, for example, on Syria, on Libya. But this daily process, I think, is very important. And with the Lisbon Treaty, I think we can see a positive effect in cooperation and also in continuity of work, which is much better than it was before in the framework of rotating troikas and rotating EU presidencies, who had their prerogatives in making the EU foreign policy. So I think this is a positive development with the creation of the EIS and with the creation of the High Representative. And maybe to conclude my introductory remarks, I have read that once High Representative Ashton said that the EIS goal was not to develop a single European voice, but rather to develop a single European message on foreign policy questions. And I think this is the idea that will be a guiding star of our today's discussions. And here on this question, actually, how our panelists see that this unified message is being made, where do they see the improvements can be made, will be something that we will discuss today. So first of all, I would like to give the floor to, as already introduced, His Excellency Mr. Peter Jan Langenberg. Maybe if I can just say a few words about his career. He's a graduate of the University of Utrecht. He has joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in The Hague in 1979. Had since then different assignments in Budapest, Washington, Canberra, Brussels, Dublin, and Antwerp. And most recently, before assuming the position in Slovenia, he was ambassador to Georgia and Armenia. And actually, this last post is what is going to be in the focus of our interest today. He, as ambassador in Tbilisi, of course, had an insight in how these common positions of the EU are made on the field, in a third country. And not only in any third country, but actually in a region in which many of the EU member states have quite distinct political interests, which of course also many times clash with the influence and interests of the Russian Federation. So I think this is something that will be very interesting to hear. And I will, of course, ask you if you can tell us how this process was made. How did you, in the field, cooperate? How did you propose common EU positions? And, of course, also, how did your national interests fit into this process? Please, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, yeah, it's working. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And good morning to all of you. One of the things I noticed when I arrived in Ljubljana was that everybody starts very early here. This is an enormous difference with Tbilisi, where I come from. There they only start around 10 o'clock, start working at 11, and they go on, I think, until 1 o'clock in the morning. But then everybody here is already well and soundly asleep. So luckily there are many cultural and other differences between countries, because this makes it interesting, not only from the foreign affairs perspective. Well, as was said, I'm fairly new here. I'm only here for half a year. And in fact, I was for the last 4 years, I was the Dutch ambassador to Georgia and to Armenia. And as you know, both are Eastern Partnership countries. And although they don't go through the same problems as the Ukraine now, there are comparable problems in their relationship with Russia, for example, and there are comparable problems which are if you look at their transition process, so to say, and them getting closer to the European Union and to Europe as far as democratic values are concerned. Now, the title of the panel, when reflecting on the title, I found it slightly difficult. The title is EU Foreign Policy, Cooperation with National Diplomacy. I'm almost inclined to say, well, shouldn't we turn it around? Should the title not have been of the panel National Policies, How Do We Cooperate with EU Foreign Policy? And it illustrates already that I feel that there has been a shift in emphasis. And there has been quite some change recently and over the years. I think that foreign policy and European policy are a different ballgame nowadays, and the rules are in fact more complicated for us. Life was simpler, I think, in the past when you just had national policies and you had some EU coordination in Brussels. This all has changed because of the Lisbon Treaty, as was mentioned, and it all has changed because the European Action Service is slowly getting on steam and becoming more and more operational. And in fact, from the national perspective, the implication is that the rules are not only more complicated, but there are many more players if you want to influence and if you want to shape foreign policies. And basically, I feel as well that there is less leeway nowadays in certain countries for national foreign policy, and there is less leeway, a different emphasis for the work of national embassies. And I went through all this process recently in Georgia and in Armenia. And in fact, I saw it change over there. When I arrived, you still had EU delegation. You still had a representative of a member state in the presidency chair, more or less being a technical chair of all the meetings of the EU member states. And this all has changed in a way. The role of the presidency, you hardly notice it anymore abroad. It is less important in Brussels as well. And the role of the EU delegation and the EU ambassador has really changed. Where in the past I still remember that if you went to a very official event or so, and if you really followed protocol, all the ambassadors of the member states came first. And then only after that, the EU head of delegation could take his seat. Now, in a way, this has changed because the level of influence and the impact of an EU ambassador has changed with the changes in the Lisbon Treaty. So the EU delegation is now in the lead, I think. It even doesn't have a technical role anymore. In fact, they're the first among equals. And at the same time, another thing that makes a difference as well, the EU delegations are in a way better staffed, do have more human resources, and do have more money. Think of all the EU subsidies than national governments have. So in a way, they are better positioned as well to reflect on policies, and they are better positioned as well to influence what's happening in the country where they are working than specific individual member states can do. So in a way, the EU delegation and the EU ambassador really have become the spokesperson for EU foreign policy. And I think that this role will only increase in the near future. Now, at the same time, where national embassies are streamlined and shrinking in a way because of budget cuts and other reasons, there are many locations as well, I think, where we are not even represented anymore. And this is a difference, I think, between the three of us here behind the table. I think that the UK will still be represented more or less all over the world. I think we still do our best to keep the embassy network going. But for newer member states with less resources, it's even more difficult, I think, to be properly represented everywhere. And this also makes a difference too, because you have almost everywhere you have an EU delegation, but you don't have everywhere a representative of every member state anymore. And this has an impact as well, I think, and this helps as well to make the role of the EU delegation, in fact, more important, and makes people reflect on the role of national embassies because of the changing impact and the changing influence they can exercise on EU foreign policies. So the member states are more and more in a supporting role, and there's less leeway for national policies. Now, this is, of course, this is fine as long as you all agree on EU foreign policy for 100%. The problem, of course, with EU foreign policy is, and I think the quotation was quite nice of Mrs. Ashton, of the High Representative, so we have to work with single European messages, yes, and we cannot speak with one voice yet, and I don't think that we do this, but it's not so easy always to speak with one voice, because then the implication would be that you would all share completely the same view. And of course, this is not the case within the EU. The problem, of course, with joint statements, joint foreign policy statements or positions is that quite often you end up with the lowest common denominator, if I may describe it in a non-diplomatic way. But this is often the case, and normally most countries would put a different emphasis or would have a different preference in their foreign policy. And Georgia was in fact an interesting posting for the last 4 years, because as you all know, when I arrived, then President Saakashvili was still there in full power, and he was seen by some as the best guarantee that Georgia would focus more and more on getting closer to Europe, and lots of people did see him as the guarantee for, participation in the EU and in NATO, for example, and bringing Georgia closer to the EU family. And this was partly true in a way. It was very much a country in transition. It was certainly not a consolidated democracy. And where they started really well, during the process, it became more and more difficult, I think, to stay on the right track. And you did see more and more that in the end for President Saakashvili, that the goal of getting Georgia closer to Europe and to NATO was more important than the means. So if there was any resistance or any opposition from civil society or from other parties who thought that it was going too quickly or had different views, this was seen as something standing in the way. And as we all have seen happening, the implication was that at a certain moment the majority of the population had the feeling that they were heading in the wrong direction, and that the whole regime became too authoritarian in a way. And it was not without reason, in fact, that Saakashvili on a certain moment had to step down, and that you had a more or less peaceful handing over of after the elections to the opposition, and Ivanishvili ended up as the new man in power, and Saakashvili in a way always described him as being pro-Russian and less democratic than he was himself. Now, of course, all the EU member states had their views on the process here as well. For example, it will not surprise you that most of the representatives of Eastern European member states that all went through the same process in a way could associate very well with what Saakashvili was trying to do and to accomplish. So there was much more understanding, I think, for the long-term goals and the problems that Saakashvili was encountering, and where lots of other EU member states were more looking at the here and now and to the democratic process itself, you had a kind of division between the member states where there was a little bit more of understanding for the way how Saakashvili was operating and keeping the long-term goal of EU membership and perspective always in the back of their minds. Well, a number of member states like the Dutch, the British or others were more focusing on the here and now. And they always felt more strongly that if from the democratic perspective something went wrong, that you should criticize them strongly as well. And this was in fact a serious different view within the EU family. This was not only the case, of course, in Tbilisi itself, but you had differences like this as well in Brussels, within the European Parliament, within the European families, and you had the same divisions within the Council. And that makes it, of course, more difficult then for an EU delegation and an EU ambassador to voice, so to say, this joint European policy and to send out a single European message. And it even becomes more complicated, of course, when the head of the EU delegation, although I must say that the process of selection in Brussels is quite serious. As Anna was saying, you don't end up easily within the European Action Service. That's for sure. But we had, for example, there's a certain tendency within the European Action Service to take, because of the knowledge in the countries involved, for example, to put in Central Africa a Belgian head of delegation, in Indonesia or Suriname a Dutch one, and they selected for Tbilisi a former prime minister from Bulgaria who went in fact through the same transition process as Saakashvili tried to accomplish. And so of course this person had much more understanding for the difficulties that Saakashvili was encountering and the long-term goal of Georgia trying to become EU member than some other member states had. And then EU foreign policy becomes very complicated, I must say. So EU foreign policy is fine as long as we all agree on foreign policy. And it's fine as well if the EU delegation there speaks with one voice as well. So there's a big difference between theory and practice. But nonetheless, what does this mean for a national member state and a national ambassador? In fact, what you have to do in a situation like that is, as the ball game is completely different and there are many more players in a way, of course, you try to have as big an input as possible and wherever possible to influence the outcome and to help to shape this European messages. You still had very regularly, you had the meetings of EU ambassadors on location, so in Tbilisi. So if there was an emergency situation or whatever, or if you did write a joint paper for Brussels, then you would all sit together and you would have your input. And of course you would try to influence this process as much as possible. Also, if something was happening which from the democratic perspective, or if there was unrest in the street, or people were put into jail without any good reasons, you could always, of course, call upon the EU delegation and your colleagues to sit together to do something about it and to make good use of the EU and your colleagues to have as strong a voice as possible. So it's still rather important, I think, to be represented on location, because there you have a direct input into the Brussels process, into the reporting of the EU delegation to the European Action Service and to Ashton. Then at the same time, you of course still have your national channels. The reports from the EU delegation end up in Brussels and in the meetings of the Foreign Affairs Council, which are prepared by our ambassadors over there, and of course where the EU delegation had a direct line with the Council Secretariat and the European Action Service. you still have your own direct link with your capital and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, another channel where you can have your input. And the implication, of course, is that in the long run, if you all sit together and you discuss foreign policy differences and issues locally as EU ambassadors with the delegation on the spot, and at the same time you do this and you have a kind of coordination process in Brussels as well, in the end, I think that you would end up with a fairly well-coordinated number of European messages and policy in the end. Now, in the case of Georgia, this was not always the case, but I think that in the long run and in most other areas, this might work pretty well. Would it still leave some space and some room for national foreign policies? Yes, I would say there's always room for that. As I was saying before, there's a certain tendency for joint EU policy positions to be the lowest common denominator. If you have much stronger views nationally, you can always try to influence it and try to influence your colleagues on the spot or look for some publicity at location. And I give you the example that for the Dutch is still a rather important foreign policy priority. It has to do with human rights. Normally we try to have a high profile in this area. But for example, we see gay rights as well as a very important part of the human rights agenda. And it will not surprise you that, especially in countries like Armenia and in Georgia, which are very, in a way, rather traditional societies with a rather big rural population, and where the role of the church, especially in Georgia, of the Orthodox Church, is quite strong. That there's not as much tolerance and understanding for people with different with a different sexual orientation than what we are used to within Europe itself. But also within the EU family, of course, we have different views. There are different views between the population in, say, Poland and in Sweden. We all know that this is the case. And this is then exactly, I think, an example where the EU still comes out, but will perhaps come out less strongly than the Dutch or the Swedes would have liked to see otherwise. And this is then an area where I think it's still useful to have well, your own representation and your possibilities to argue an issue more strongly and try to influence the process in a more positive way. How this will develop further in the near future, well, this is difficult to predict, but I suppose that it will be a little bit the same as with economic policies as well, where in fact the EU has in fact taking over mostly from as far as commercial interests are concerned, and economic interest has taken over mostly from national authorities and from national embassies. But even there, whatever way the decision-making process is taking place in Brussels and in the economic area, this is different from the political area. Even there, I think the EU will never be able to always fully represent a national interest. For example, I cannot imagine that if Philips had a specific interest in Georgia or in Armenia, that if the deputy head of the EU delegation would have been French, that he would do as much his best for a Dutch company or as perhaps for a French company. So there's always a national interest left, I think. So there is always, I think, a reason to be represented yourself as well abroad, whatever way you do it, national embassy or otherwise. It's only, I think, that the focus and the intensity of your work in a national embassy will fundamentally change further over the years. And whatever you feel about it, it's not so important. This is life, and you have to make the best of it. So I leave it like that.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, for this, I would say, a very interesting insight in how your work as Ambassador of the Netherlands looked in making common EU policies in Georgia and Armenia. I think what was very interesting is that you said that in this post-Lisbon period, you could feel that the EU delegation was becoming more important, that the EU representative was becoming a more important figure in the policy making in third countries. And I think it was also very interesting that you said that that you felt that there was less leeway for the work of national embassies in the field. But then at the same time, you sort of, with the example of your country, show that nevertheless, where your country, where a member state has specific political interest, it is still important that you keep your representation in the field. Because I think that, especially in this time of financial crisis, there could be ideas in national diplomacies to sort of limit your national representations and say, okay, we have an EU delegation there, so there's not so important that we keep our national embassy and have all these costs. Maybe we can just second a national expert in the EU delegation and sort of get the information and data from the EU delegation. So I'm just maybe having an additional question to you, whether you think that this kind of logic could work.
Well, I don't know if seconding somebody within the EU delegation is a solution. I think if you second somebody in the European Action Service, he becomes a full member of the European Action Service. So, in a way, it is not so that he will be double-headed and will work for the EU and for a national interest at the same time. And I'm not 100% sure that EU delegations would like to open up for a whole, would like to sublease to a whole number of individual representatives of member states. Personally, I don't think this would be a good solution in a way. It's not different if you have a representative within a UN organization or within an EU organization. People always very easily go native in their new organization where they work, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. I absolutely agree with your point of view. I just wanted sort of to hear your position on this as well. Well, now I will turn to our colleague who came from the UK, from London, from a Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Mr. Adam Kettle-Williams. I would say that having a representative of the UK among us, I think we cannot avoid the fact that the UK is one of the most skeptical EU member states when speaking about enhancing the EU foreign policy at the expense of national prerogatives and competencies in foreign affairs. Of course, I don't intend that we speak about the possible referendum of the UK's membership in the EU today. This is not the topic. But nevertheless, I think that this development in the UK, of course, has effect on the future of the EU foreign policy and of EU foreign policy making in Brussels. So, Mr. Kettle-Williams, I think I will ask you for your views as a representative of the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office on this post-Lisbon period in the EU foreign policy.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna. And Dobro jutro. So I thought I'd start off by using the local language. As a Brit, we're not known for our language skills. I'm afraid that's the extent of it. So that's what I'll be able to say. But firstly, just like to say, very pleased to be here, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. As Anna explained, I'm head of the bilateral team in London in the Foreign Office for Northern and Central Europe, which looks at bilateral relationships with 17 countries in Northern and Central Europe, which also includes Ireland. So that's where our team comes from. Previously to that, my roles have included trying to coordinate the Foreign Office staff and military staff in London and overseas closer together as one team. There's a big push at the moment to bring together government departments in London. So I was involved heavily in bringing the resources and expertise of both government departments together. Previously to that, I carried out consular work in Spain. As you may know, we have many Brits, about 700,000 Brits who live in Spain, and about 15 million Brits who visit Spain annually. So it's a very big consular patch for us. So I worked in there. Previously to that, I was involved in EU programme work, so making sure that the UK's role in certain programmes such as Twinning and TIEX involved in sharing UK public sector expertise with countries who wish to join the EU closer. And before that, I was involved in exports. Exports is a big push of our country, and was involved in helping small companies export their goods overseas, with a particular focus on Southeast Asia. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of some of the roles that I've carried out, and it also gives you an idea of where the Foreign Office places their staff to see their priorities. Today I was going to give you a very brief overview of how we see Europe from the Foreign Office side, and I was going to break it down into 3 parts. The first part, I was going to give a very brief overview of the Foreign Office itself, its priorities and structure. Secondly, I was going to give you a very brief overview of how we're structured on Europe. And thirdly, I was going to give a very brief introduction and overview of what we are saying on Europe. So I understand that our views at times are not well received, so please be gentle when I leave the hotel. So firstly, when it comes to the introduction of the Foreign Office, the current format of the organisation is the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So it was formed it brought together the Commonwealth Office and the Foreign Office, as known as Ministry of Foreign Affairs in other parts of the world, in 1968. So in terms of its current format, it's not very old. In Britain, we've currently got a coalition government, Lib Dems and Conservative. It was formed in 2010. Within the Foreign Office, we've got 6 ministers, headed up by William Hague, who's the Secretary of State, and underneath then 5 separate ministers. And we have a dedicated Minister for Europe. We also share a minister with UK Trade and Investment. So that's the part where, as UK Trade and Investment and the Foreign Office are 2 separate organisations, but there's a strong emphasis to make sure that both organisations are working on the same page. So in terms of the organisation's priorities, the coalition government clarified them because it was felt that it wasn't as clear as it could have been in the past. So it's broken down into 3 main priorities. 1, to keep the UK safe. 2, to make the UK more prosperous. And 3, to support Brits overseas. So they say that if your work doesn't fall into those 3 categories, you shouldn't be doing it. So that's how it works. In terms of the numbers of staff that we've got to do this, we've got 15,000 staff based in London and overseas, in 270 posts in over 150 countries. So we've got quite broad range. But when I say posts, that can be anything from a consulate, an embassy, high commission, which is our embassies in the Commonwealth, to very, very small trade teams. Recently, as has been seen across Europe, there's been a large period of change, which has seen many cuts to our operation. And we have seen resource moved around the world in what we've called the network shift. And in the past, where we'd have very large embassies in capitals in Europe, many staff and resource is being pushed eastwards and southwards. So we've got new consulates opening in China and India. We've got new embassies in South America. So you can see that the organisation as a whole is moving slightly away from its traditional platform in Europe. There is a greater focus on cross-government working. As I explained in the start, one of my roles was bringing together government departments. So there's a very strong focus on this. So at ministerial level, there's much more structure to make sure that government departments are working with each other. There's more co-owned funding programs, and there's more joint business planning with the idea that government as a whole is running in the same way. Also within the Foreign Office, this period of change has encouraged the organisation to re-look at the skill set that its staff has to be able to deliver those three priorities. So, for example, there's a strong emphasis on building up the commercial skills of our staff, whether in London and overseas, and much more interchange between industry. So ambassadors, before they go out to their overseas post, they're strongly encouraged to spend time in the companies that they'll be working with. Vice versa, companies are encouraged to work a lot more with the Foreign Office so we can understand how we work together. Linked to my first point about language skills, we are aware that this puts us in a weak place when dealing in certain parts of the world. So in the last year, we've established a brand new language centre, which obviously won't solve all the language issues that we have, but is building in that sort of step change in how we see the skill set of our staff. So that's the first part of the presentation, to give you a very brief overview of the context of what's going on in the Foreign Office. The second part, I will talk briefly about how we are structured on Europe. So the Europe section of the Foreign Office is probably one of the largest. And it's broken down into themes or regions. As explained at the start, we've got a dedicated Europe minister, who I think has been the longest serving Europe minister than the previous three combined. So he's been in since 2010, and he's known as a Euro pragmatist. Which may give you an idea as where the policy on Europe would go. So in terms of the section on Europe in London, we have teams that cover enlargement, justice and home affairs, the councils, future of Europe, which is a growing resource within our organisation, particularly with the general elections due next year. We've also got a Scotland team, and you may have seen in the press, referendum later this year. So we've got a team looking at the foreign policy and the Europe implications if Scotland were to become an independent country. And you've also got the purely bilateral teams. And there's a strong focus at the moment to not forget our bilateral partners. Because whether you're working in the EU, UN, or any multilateral organisation, those can't work without very strong bilateral links in the first place. So there's a strong emphasis to make sure that our relationships with certain key partners are maintained. On Europe, there's a strong interest also amongst Whitehall, which is other government departments within London and UK. So the Cabinet Office has a very strong Europe focus, Home Office, Ministry of Justice, and also UKREP in Brussels, which is our team managed out there. And it's a sign that is one of our most senior civil servants who heads up UKREP in Brussels, which gives you an idea of the prominence that role plays, and also Paris being one of our biggest posts with one of our most senior staff. So people will say that the UK is trying to move away from Europe, but those things show that we're still interested and we still want to maintain close links. There's also very regular ministerial committees on Europe, either hosted by the Foreign Secretary or the Minister for Europe. So in terms of our activity and focus on Europe, it's strong. So that's the second part of my presentation. The third part is what the UK is saying on Europe. And in these current times, as with the whole of Europe and the world, the economic problems are a focus for the government. So its prime focus, or one of its prime focuses, is to develop that. But as I've just explained, Europe is high on the agenda in Britain. You'll see there's a lively debate in the press, in the Parliament, in the coalition government, and even within parties within the coalition government. So you'll see there's a strong debate. And even if you ask the public, people normally have quite strong views either way on what the UK should be doing in Europe. So in terms of the government policy, our policy is not to leave the EU. There was a referendum bill which Anna mentioned, but it failed because it couldn't get an agreement within its parliamentary process. But the Conservative Party have said that if they come into power next year, they will plan to hold a referendum to ask the UK public on whether it should stay in or stay out of Europe. But the current government is very clear that membership of the EU is in the UK's interests. So almost half of our trade is to EU partners. 3 million jobs in the UK are linked to the EU. And working collectively as the EU proves some tangible successes, whether it be on counter-piracy off the Horn of Africa or free trade agreements with Canada. There are some concrete things that really clarify that it's in the UK's interest. And there was the point about EEAS, which Anna mentioned at the start. And the view that we have is that the EEAS on the ground can have great access to other multilateral organisations such as UN and others, which bilaterally countries wouldn't be able to access. It would also be able to monitor the EU programme spend a lot better than it has done in the past, and also give countries like ourselves, but also smaller member states, reach around the world, which other countries don't currently have. But as has also been explained earlier today, there is a feeling that it must be clear as to what the EEAS is doing and what the MFAs around the world are doing, because if not, it's a very expensive way to duplicate. And going on what I was saying about the strong bilateral issues and the prominence of bilateral links that the UK currently places, it feels that putting too much emphasis and importance on the EEAS would put at risk certain links that we have with other key nations around the world. And also from a practical point of view, there aren't many Brits in the EEAS. There aren't many Brits within the Commission, and there aren't many Brits working in Brussels. We're way under the quota in terms of the size of our country. This could be linked to people not being interested, not seeing it as a good career, but it also comes down to my first point today, is that when we enter competitions, we never seem to get past the language point, and we can't compete. So there's a practical point why there's not as many Brits as there are with other nations. So we do see the benefits, but we have to think of our own interests when promoting such organisations as the EEAS, so that it doesn't duplicate what other MFAs are doing. That's the main point on that. So in terms of what's been said at the very high level from our side, the Prime Minister gave a speech last January, the Deputy Prime Minister gave a speech last October, and both speeches had a very strong theme that we want to stay in the EU, but the EU needs to be improved and slightly reformed. because it was felt that if it stays as it is, it won't be able to keep up with the rest of the world, and public confidence in the EU will start to decrease. So there's three main areas where the UK thinks that the EU could do more on. In terms of competition, there's a strong feeling within the UK that particularly small companies are flooded by bureaucratic hurdles that they need to jump through to trade within the EU and outside the EU. So the Prime Minister has established a business task force to bring in leaders from large organisations to look at what regulations could be cut or just don't help a small or medium-sized firm to do business in or outside the EU. So that's a strong focus. And also an expansion of the digital single market is a key priority. If you can't buy things online, as in if you were in your own country, that's not a single market. That's still trading with a foreign country. So the benefits of being in the EU are not as clear as they could be. So that's the first point. The second point is a very strong feeling within UK is that the EU needs to be flexible. As the EU grows, 28 countries, you can't have one size fits all. The UK has been accused of cherry picking in the past and just saying, right, we'll take that there, but we don't want that there. But the strong feeling is that trying to impose the same rules on such a wide variety of countries is simply not practical. And encouraging countries to work with each other in a collaborative way rather than being told to by an HQ of any organisation is going to have more results in our mind. And the third point is that very strong feeling that we would want the European Parliament to be an accountable force more. So we want the role of national parliaments to have a stronger say, whether there's certain things that we've laid down numerous times on if say a third of parliaments within the EU had a strong opposition to a particular proposal or legislation, it should have the power to either slow down or stop legislation, not just let it be sort of running through anyway. So that's the sort of third strand of the push on where we would like to see the EU go. But the key thing is that the key thing that is stressed all the time is that we think these changes would be of benefit to all member states. It's not the UK going ahead and saying, right, we want to do this because it increases our links here, we want to do this because it's good for our interests. We genuinely feel that if the organisation has a look at these and it's shared by other member states, it would be of benefit to all. So that concludes my brief overview today. So just to summarise, I gave a quick overview of the Foreign Office, priorities, structure, the size. I gave a quick overview of the structure on Europe and how we're faced, and just a quick overview on some of the things the UK are currently saying on Europe and the EU. So I hope that's of use.
Thank you very much, Adam. I think your presentation is what we expected. You spoke much more about the UK's priorities than the EU foreign policy, so very much expected from your side. I think it gave a very interesting overview of your organizational structure and the policies. When you were speaking in the first part about the organization and the work of the Foreign Office, of course, we could think how far away, or if ever, the EAS would be able to structure itself in such manner. And also, I was thinking that the EU delegations around the world, of course, will always have a problem comparing it to traditional member states' embassies in especially two points. This is first the economic diplomacy, which was also mentioned by by the ambassador. So who will they work for? Who will they make business for? And then the second area where I see the lack of possibility for the EU delegation is the consular and diplomatic protection of its citizens, which is still mostly in the prerogative of national embassies and member states. Thank you very much. I think that our guests today will be very much interested to ask you some further questions on the reforms that the UK is proposing in the EU framework. But now I would like to turn to Ambassador Leon Marc, who is a Deputy Secretary General at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Slovenia. Mr. Marc holds a Master in Public Diplomacy and Management from the University of London. In his career at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he worked at the Minister's Office in the Embassy of the Republic of Slovenia to Ireland and as a head of Southeast Europe Division. And before the appointment to the current post, he was the Ambassador of the Republic of Slovenia to the Kingdom of Netherlands. As I mentioned already in the beginning, I believe that small diplomacies can benefit enormously from taking part in the making of the European foreign policy. Here I'm mostly thinking of two examples. First of all, small diplomacies like Slovenia, of course, have limited resources and limited ability to be present in the field in third countries. And I think that through the EU delegations, Slovenia can receive additional information and data on the situation in the ground. Then the second example is that Slovenia as a small country, through the European foreign policy and through the common positions and strategies, can become a part of a strategic player in international organizations where Slovenia as a small country would probably not have the capacity to get involved in certain areas, for example, disarmament, maybe issues that are not so close to us. We all know that the EU foreign policy is made by consensus, so this is of course an important part which does not allow big member states to bypass small ones when we speak about their vital national interests. But I think that in reality there is a question whether small states can really greatly influence making of EU foreign policy in reality, in everyday's life. So Leon, you currently work very closely with the EIS, mainly on the issues of including Slovenian national experts in the EIS system. So I think that what I will ask you to explain is your views, whether you think that Slovenia, a small member state, is equally and sufficiently represented in the EU institutions dealing with foreign policy, and whether you think that Slovenia in certain areas, for example, in making policies towards Western Balkans, there are certain areas where we can play a role, a major role in making EU foreign policy. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for this opportunity to speak here. I indeed currently work on the corporate management side of the Foreign Ministry here, so I will focus a bit more on the Slovenia in the European External Action Service. But perhaps it could, after hearing my Dutch and British colleague, it would be worth saying that at least in the wider public in Slovenia, we have seldom experienced a gap between, or a major gap between the EU foreign policy and the national foreign policy. One example, and even this is probably a bit more limited to foreign ministry circles, was the EU policy towards Western Balkans, where we were sometimes seen as perhaps overtly ambitious, overtly optimistic, and while we thought that perhaps the EU was a little bit too cautious or not enough forthcoming to the Western Balkans. But in the wider public, I don't think in Slovenia we have experienced a gap in the public opinion between the EU foreign policy views and the views of our own government. Anyway, the making of an EU foreign policy is certainly not an easy exercise, though I don't think we should see this only as a weakness on the part of the European Union, but also as a genuine reflection of the respect for the national positions. Brussels, if you call it that way, is aware that there are national positions and national sensitivities, and that this must be looked at and consideration of them taken. And we discussed a little bit speaking with one voice, and we settled for one message, and we also said, well, sometimes we have to satisfy with the lowest common denominator, but I think that sometimes calls for one single voice may in fact be a disguised call for one particular national voice, and that is equally not the right way to go. I think that the goal of one single message, if we talk about message rather than voice, would come as a confluence of two processes. And one process is further deepening of the European Union, greater cohesion of the European Union, in which distinct national foreign policies will by themselves, in a more natural way, disappear or become less pronounced. And the second process is the process of further globalization, where there will simply be a need for a common EU position, where even major countries of the European Union will not be able by themselves to exert enough influence on an issue, on a global agenda. So I think from that point of view, we can be more pragmatic about the future of the European Union. We don't need to be ideological about it, but these common message may effectively come as a result of the globalization, a result of the need of what is happening in the world. So if we look at the current financial crisis, on one hand, of course, we witness a sort of EU countries trying to safeguard their own national interests, but on the other hand, they are aware that at least part of this problem of the financial crisis needs to be done at the cross-EU level. We discussed already a little bit the issue of the bilateral embassies and the need of the bilateral embassies, and even before the External Action Service coming into effect, there was a lot of discussion in academic circles and among practitioners about what is the value of bilateral diplomacies today. And currently, I think the tide is against the thinking that bilateral embassies are something of the past, and I was encouraged by what my British colleagues said. And we are also seeing in some other big diplomacies, but also in some other smaller diplomacies. I was recently reading a paper by the Irish Foreign Service, in which they enthusiastically support the idea of a flexible and modest, but still important position of the bilateral embassies even within the European Union, not only abroad. So I think that these calls for that bilateral embassies will suddenly become less important have missed the point to quite a degree, and also reflect a false understanding of the External Action Service. Certainly, the External Action Service has little or no bearing whatsoever on the bilateral embassies within the European Union. I think as I said, there's a growing consensus that the bilateral embassies within the European Union have to change, have to refocus, but that they can add an indispensable complementary information to what you can hear in the corridors of Brussels, or from what you can hear in direct communication between the EU leaders. Different is the case, of course, for the third countries, where the scope for leaving the job, or at least to share resources with the EU delegation, of course, is much greater. And we have heard some of the examples before from my Dutch colleague. I guess that the arrangements, the local arrangements, will very much depend on the historical background of relations of that particular third country with the European Union or with particular European countries. And sometimes it will be the EU delegation that will have the lead, and sometimes it will be the EU delegation that will be on the learning end of the local arrangements. There is already a great deal of sharing of information. The national embassies in third countries can now subscribe to ACID, the information system of the European Union. So, but the truth is that this is still very much left to the locals, to the local EU heads of mission, as well as to the local EU head of delegation. And a great deal depends on the goodwill from their side. So I think that a new equilibrium will have to be found on both sides, both on how the national diplomacies are organized in third countries and their missions there, and how EU delegations in these countries are organized, so that the mix of both can enable the best of possible understanding of and covering of the interests of EU and the nation states. It's important to be realistic about that, but at the same time, it's important that at least the messages coming from the national embassies and the EU delegations are not too diverging, at least to be modest in our expectations. If we talk a little bit further about the External Action Service, an obvious target for sharing the resources is certainly, and this has been already mentioned today, the consular services. Of course, we have some legal difficulties there. The consular aspect is not included among the tasks of the External Action Service. We know that some member states have capacities large enough on their own and do not need the pressure of the need for that, or some feel that this is going too far into an area that is one of the is a part of their sovereignty. But if we look from the point of view of smaller EU member states, then certainly this is a very attractive option. And also from the public diplomacy side of view for the European Union, imagine an EU citizen in distress in a remote part of the world where there's no national embassy or very few national embassies, certainly not his own national embassy, and he's suddenly being assisted by an European consular worker. This is certainly sending a very powerful message about, well, I can rely on the EU delegation rather than to knock on the door of another EU embassy, which of course is always there. So I think for the future, this should be an area worth exploring further. At the moment, the External Action Service does not possess neither the expertise nor the resources for that. Except for what was recently termed in one of the papers, coordination in cases of a major consular crisis situation, this is what we can hope for at the moment. Here I come to the issue, and it was already mentioned before, issue of the temporary agents, that is of national diplomats being seconded to the EU delegations across the world. First, we must say that we have a very short record of that at the moment, so it's quite difficult to make an assessment about how well this is working, either from the side of the External Action Service itself or from the side of the national diplomacies. The immediate focus when External Action Service came into existence was to secure attractive or important positions of the EU head of delegations across the world. And as you know, this attracted quite some attention here in Slovenia, even in public. And finally, now we have 2 EU heads of delegation at the moment. And this, of course, has some relevance for the let's say, for the public diplomacy effort of the European Union. But I think we are here in a danger of missing a point too. The goal of 1/3 nationals in the External Action Service may perhaps or should not be seen or taken in too of a mechanical way. And there has been some difficulties with that in the past. We have to be fair to the External Action Service management and say that they have to square on one hand this requirement for 1/3 national in the service, and more or less they have reached that requirement. But they have to square with the limited budget resources and also with the career ambitions of the permanent staff of the External Action Service. And this is not an easy situation, and it reminds me a little bit of the situation let's say in Slovenia and in other countries in transition in 1990s, whereby in civil service you had civil servants from the past, and most of them were retained in the service, but at the same time there was a very reasonable expectation for an influx of fresh blood into the service, and suddenly you had a sort of a conflict between those that were there and the new entrants, and there is a degree of that happening in the External Action Service. A solution to that, in my view, would be to look at the temporary agents from the national member states in a less mechanical way, but to look for where is the added value of these national diplomats, and there certainly is. They bring skills like classic diplomatic skills and classic consular skills that usually the permanent staff in the External Action Service does not possess. So this is one area. They also bring some specific expertises. We discussed that before, the expertise or the first-hand experience of a country in transition. If we look at the diplomats coming from the new EU member states, that of course may represent also a bias, but if rightly put into effect, it can be indeed an added value. We are witnessing countries in transition across the world today. Ukraine, Georgia was mentioned, Myanmar. So there is a scope for that, for that expertise to be put into effect. So far, we had this 1/3 quota, but the External Action Service has resisted the idea of some sort of national quotas for the External Action Service. Although I think we have to be less ideological about that. Professional criteria and meritocracy, of course, should apply. But when we judge the experience of a diplomat, of a national diplomat, of working with a sizable budget or a sizable organization, then, of course, diplomats from major countries would win by default. It's very difficult, say, for a civil servant from Slovenia to have an experience of managing a budget of, let's say, several tens of millions of euro, or managing organization of more than 100 persons. So it's very difficult to come to that. So some degree of national quota would be perhaps worth discussing, or would not be entirely out of place. And I was happy to learn that perhaps even UK might benefit from that from completely another perspective. The other problem that we experience, in particular as a small member state, is the dilemma: should we send to the External Action Service the best or the junior? And there was some discussion about that before, and certainly seconding people to the EU delegations is certainly not seconding somebody for the purpose of representing national interest there. He has to become a part of the team. He has to defend the EU interest. Certainly, there is some scope for let's say for being there in the some very limited scope for being there in a national capacity, or perhaps being of some assistance to let's say to his own officials from his own country coming to that particular country. He can be a little bit of a helping hand in that, but of course his national capacity, so to say, is very limited and should be limited. So there is a big discussion for what exact purpose are we sending people there? Is it to have some sort of national leverage, or perhaps to send junior people to learn the trade of a EU foreign policy? So what is then happening is that, of course, if a small country is very determined to win a particular offer for a particular secondment, it would usually have to offer an overqualified candidate, at least overqualified to in their own terms, but that may represent a loss for their own national service. So I think after only a couple of years of External Action Service, I think we're still at a too early stage to be able to fully evaluate all these relations and what good does it make to second a person to the EU External Action Service. So, in short, we have already heard that the creation of EU foreign policy will obviously take some time. So I think that the fine-tuning of the External Action Service and the stake of the national diplomacy in this will also take time, and we will have to be patient with that. But I would again return to the whole complex of the economic issues, of the common economic agenda. In the current crisis, we've seen both. We've seen efforts to safeguard national interests, but at the same time efforts to make certain things, to do certain things together, because regardless of how we look at how we ideologically look at the EU future, and in this country we are very religiously pro-European, nevertheless we are all aware that certain things can indeed be done better on a common ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leon, for your presentation. I think you gave an insight to some very interesting points, especially if we look at this conference as a part of the project Europe for Citizens. I think that the question of consular protection is a very important one. I mean, this is something that people will see in their everyday life, and they will understand it as something that matters in EU foreign policy. They will not see the statements we make in the UN, the statements we make in the OSCE, etc. They will see when they have a problem and they come to the EU delegation and they are offered help and assistance. So I think this point is very interesting from the point of view of also, in a sense, public diplomacy, and also in a sense of helping European citizens to be a part of this common European foreign policy. So I think we are actually running out of time. So without delay, I will open the floor for some questions for our panelists. Please.
Trautmann, Pan-Europa Austria. I have one question to Mr. Kettle-Williams. Have you got any information for the case that Scotland, the voting, will be a separate country? Have you got any information how the EU will handle that case? Because the problem is not only concerning, I think, England and Wales, but also the whole Europe. We have similar problems in other countries, like Spain or Italy or even Belgium. Have you got any information how can this case be handled, not only for England, but for whole Europe? Thank you.
Ulrich Krotz, I'm a professor of international relations at the European University Institute in Florence. This is also a question for Mr. Kettle-Williams. If I
told you.
No, it's politically hard. It's a short question. It might take a long answer. If I heard you right, what you or your organization or your government would consider the best outcome is as if you get as much as any possible of the 3 points you mentioned, meaning more flexibility, less regulation, especially with small and medium-sized businesses, and involvement of national parliaments. I probably would agree with that. The best would be for the UK and for Europe if you get a lot and in the end stay. But as I'm sure you know better than I do, this is quite a gamble. Your government will have to have results to present to the British public to say, we did well, we have something, in order to strongly recommend to stay in. And this is, of course, my question. I understand it's a difficult question. You might not be able to give clear points here, but even if you could just talk about your hunches, what do you think would be enough, or what would be sufficient so that your government could say to the public of the United Kingdom, we did well. Europe, the EU will be better if we stay in, thanks to our efforts here, and therefore we should have good reasons to stay in. I would be very interested to learn about your views, what you think your government will have to be able to show.
How much are your countries able to give to the British?
Hello, my name is Igor Kovac. I'm Vice President of the Slovenian Pan-European Movement. And at the beginning of this conference, our President, Mr. Ladislav Gajser, said to us, let's be provocative. So I will be provocative. Why do we need Foreign Action Service, actually? If we make our cooperation of national diplomacies much more efficient, much more effective. I had the privilege to serve with Anna at our mission to OSCE, and there was a coordination meeting before every council meeting with the EU members. So if these coordination meetings become really effective, if we delegate, I don't know, once to Slovenia, the other time to UK and to Netherlands, different topics, you are now obliged to solve this problem. These are the stance of the EU. If we make this cooperation and coordination much more effective, also in terms of what Anna mentioned regarding the consular affairs, why do we need the institution, the structure, if the substance can be done with already existing structure? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, another question? No, okay.
Just leave
Okay, okay. Thank you very much to all of you. I think I will first give the floor to Adam, because I think you have a lot to answer. And then a flight to catch. and then we'll continue. Please.
Great, thank you. No, I was only joking about the flight, so I wouldn't get any more things to answer. But so firstly, on Scotland, yes, and I can talk from a personal side with a mother from Glasgow and a father from Oxford. So from a personal side, we're not very keen for the two countries to separate. But from a government side, it's been very clear that the government feels, and all political parties feel, that both countries, the UK and Scotland, would be stronger with each other. And you would have seen recently that the government has accused the Scottish parties running the independence campaign of maybe not being as thought through with their plans as they could be. So the Chancellor gave a speech 2 weeks ago on the currency issue. as the Scotland side explained, that it would be an expectation that they keep the pound. And then the Chancellor made a speech in Edinburgh saying that if you walked away from the UK, you would probably have to walk away from the pound. He was then accused afterwards of bullying. And then you'll also, there's a political show in Britain called the Andrew Marr Show, which is a Sunday morning show, and they normally get very high-level senior speakers and politicians on there. 2 weeks ago, Barroso was on there and made some very clear views as to how he thought it would be particularly complicated for Scotland to rejoin the EU. So with this year, with Catalonia having a referendum in the same year as a Scottish referendum, there's certain member states that would not particularly be that keen for a smaller country to break away from a larger one to rejoin the EU. Scotland's answer is that the organisations and structures that it has already are up to EU standards. So they see being blocked to rejoin the EU when they've already met the criteria is unfair. But I think from a political side, it would make it very complicated. But there are there's a series of policy analysis papers from the government that have been issued. Recently, about last month, there was a paper on the international implications, and that had a strong focus on the challenges of Scotland rejoining an EU. So I'd recommend having a look on it. It's all open source. It's all out there on the internet. So in terms of a personal view, I think it would be complicated and not the right thing to do. But from a government view, they've made it clear that it's not as easy as just separating and then being still a part of the organisations, NATO, EU, UN, etc. So in short, it's extremely complex. Has that, I don't know if that's, yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, please.
Well, first of all, to go back to what is needed for the UK to stay in the EU, I thought it was interesting to hear my British colleague say we want to stay in the EU, but he didn't say we want to leave the EU unless. So this is something that whatever you are reading in the media, that you should realize there's a difference between speculation on how the electorate in the UK might vote in a referendum in the future and what the current position of the British government is. And in fact, the 3 points that he mentioned, they're not so far away from views on Europe in other EU member states, like in Holland as well, for example. Because saying, well, we want to have less bureaucratic hurdles and less red tape. Well, the Netherlands is all for it. Then he said the EU needs to be more flexible, not one size fits all. Yes, cherry picking is slightly negative, but it's a principle that has been applied to the EU already. Think about the Eurozone or think about the banking union that we are working on. So theoretically, this is still, without reason, this is feasible. And then he said the role of the national parliaments should be stronger. I think that Slovenia, Holland, and the UK all share here the same opinion. So in a way, within reason, I think that we should be able to work it out. What we try to do in the Netherlands as well is we advocate the subsidiarity principle. So let every decision be taken on the level where it is best handled. That can be on the national level, but it can be on the EU level as well. Banking union, yeah, perhaps on the EU level. Other things perhaps more on the national level. And let the EU work better. If it does something, take a responsibility. Let's do it better. And don't try to add all kinds of new tasks if it's not really necessary. So the views are not that wide apart as sometimes is suggested. Yes, I think that it was mentioned before as well that the consular, it's completely ridiculous, I think, if you're working in an embassy in a third country and all the Schengen countries, in fact, apply basically the same rules. that all the embassies still have a separately staffed consular section. You can economize there, and I think it would look much better to the European citizens, as you were saying, if you would have just one office that you, well, a one-stop office where you could go for help. And then would the difference between the European Action Service and a better coordination of national foreign services, well, I'm inclined to think that the European Action Service, the EU, has much more leverage in a globalizing world and in third countries than every member state itself, even the UK. So if the European Action Service sends out a message that we all share, they are much more affected than we would ever be nationally. So from that perspective, I would not do away with the European Action Service. On the contrary, let it work to your own benefit and leave it like that.
Thank you very much. Leon, you want to add something?
Well, there was a question of what are we bringing to the European Union, and to be entirely undiplomatic, I could say Slovenia is bringing a first-hand experience and expertise on how to become independent. Yeah. But on a more serious note, we can see, of course, very different cases here. Adam just mentioned the Scots would like to keep the pound. Slovenia couldn't wait to get rid of Yugoslav dinar when it became independent. So there's a great deal of difference. But on the other question, why do we need External Action Service? I cannot but agree with what Peter just said. That of course in a globalized world, it makes all of a difference to have a common position rather than just a coordination of a national position. And I also liked what he was talking about, subsidiarity principle. I think that's it's a very old principle of I think even in pan-European movement, in the fathers of this movement, subsidiarity principle featured very prominently, and was then sort of forgotten, and perhaps is occasionally seen as a bit of a old-fashioned principle, but it's kicking again. So it's worth remembering that, because that's a position where very pro-European, let's say pro-European positions meet perhaps those that are a bit more hesitant or a bit more coming from a different perspective. I think this is subsidiarity is where different positions can actually meet together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Leon. Thank you very much to all the panelists, and to you who stayed with us this Sunday morning. I think well, we have extended our time limit a bit, but I think it was worth it. We tried to reveal the complexity of this interconnectivity between the EU foreign policy and national diplomacies. I hope that we managed to reveal some of the open issues and some of the prospects for the future. I dare to conclude that this constant struggle of 28 member states for common positions, for the lowest common denominator on a daily basis is I would say beyond imagination of any other sovereign state in the world. I think that this project is a very unique project in a global sense, and that this project is possible only among democratic, tolerant states which are grounded on the same and common values and ethics. Thank you very much for your attention, and I think I give the floor to Laris, who will close this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much to the panelists. It's working? Yeah. So we have reached the end. Before I will present to the panelists our little homage present that we have done last year. This is a book that we published for the first time in history of Pan-Europa in Slovenian and English language, our manifesto. And for the first time after 90 years, we republished the English version. The only English book still existing has been found by Igor in Geneva in a little library. So we used that little old book used by the Société des Nations in the past in order to issue this protocolar book that is also used by the Slovenian Railways as a protocolar present. So thank you very much once again to the panelists, because I'm very glad to hear that the European external action and the national diplomatic networks are still very much important. That's nice, because it means, at least it means that we need new job posts. So it's GDP positive moment. We reached the end. Thank you very much for your attention so far. Thank you very much, all the panelists, all the distinguished guests, for having accepted my beginning appeal to not be polite, to not be politically correct, to be different. Somebody, I have to say, even overpassed this safety line in front of the TV cameras and with the newspaper, Professor Krotz, for example, Professor Caracciolo. If we are going to close tomorrow, don't worry, we are not guilty. No, thank you very much. It's just a joking, of course. Leaving these jokes apart, well, I think that is the first, so far, I'm concerned, it's the first time the Slovenian non-governmental organization organized such an event in Slovenia under the high auspices of three big bodies as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as the European Parliament, and the European Commission. So compliments to everybody. I think the content was very good. It is showed by the presence of all the national TV on all the biggest national newspapers, also the scandalistic newspapers. So I'm very glad that everybody reported about us. Leaving Mr. Frattini in the morning, I also warned him that if he is going to be appointed as a General Secretary of NATO, we did it. So he has to remind this always, every time. Well, I would like also to share with my dear colleagues, but I will do it later. Well, this conference now is closed. I can be frank with you. More than a conference, this conference has been a battlefield. Very likely you did not feel that problem, but we had really a moment that was very panicky. The chaos arrived in this conference. We managed 4 persons in the hospital, 1 under the surgery, the problem with Frattini escort, 1 rescue for Professor Krotz from Frankfurt, then the 2nd rescue for the luggage. Everything has been done very well, so we are very happy. And of course, if you did not feel these problems, it's just because the fantastic staff that we have at the Pan-Europa. I have to thank them, really. I really believe that they can, from today, they can write and also carry on classes about the crisis management. Really, that's unbelievable what they did. Compliments already come tonight to me for everybody, so I'm sharing with you from the cabinet of the Prime Minister, from the Minister of the Defense, from the Minister of the Interior, from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Italy, from many embassies, and directly from the Parliament of Republic of Slovenia. So it means that you did very well. Thank you very much. Well, once again. Now, let me thank also, and this is just for the conclusion, the diplomats that followed this event. I'm very much proud, I have to say, and I have to thank you. The positive response, regardless the absence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, that it means that well, I have to say, this is very much for us. Not only for the Slovenian Pan-European movement, but for the international Pan-European movement. It means that we are doing well. And we have a very long history. Sometimes it's a little bit old-fashioned, but in the last 2 years, in the last 20 months, we tried to reshape or restructure a little bit the Pan-European movement. And I think that after the warm-up moment, we are doing very well, and this conference is showing also to you what is going on. Why we do it? Well, we are not earning money from that. We are not even covering our expenses, just because we like it. We like it, and we believe in the brightest and better future. There are maybe two reasons also why we are doing that. One is an interior, and one is an external reason. The external reason is Europe. As you can see, we are very much critical about the European Union. We are starting from Pan-Europa, we are leaving the European Union, but we would like to have still a glue sticking us together for a better future, but we are very much critical on what is going on. So we are provocative in this reason. The internal reason is a Slovenian reason. When I took over the presidency of the Slovenian Pan-European movement, I clearly stated why I'm doing it. Because I believe that the Slovenian political system is very much closed. Nobody can join the politics because there is no cooptation system as everywhere around the world, especially, for example, in England, with the old history, Italy. The system, the political elites are more open because they know how to survive and how to live. Well, this is not still the story of Slovenia after 20 years of independence. And I believe that Slovenia needs a pan-European movement, like a sort of think tank where everybody, left, right, upper and the lower, can join this organization in order to find himself, herself, and to shape a vision of the future in order to be prepared maybe in the future to join the politics or international diplomacy. And the last appeal, why I'm sharing with you these thoughts is because the presence of the diplomats today means very much to us, and I would like also to appeal on you that if you would like to collaborate with us in the future, we are ready, we are here. If you think that we can share with the Slovenian broader public opinion some thoughts, problems about Europe, or if you would like to channel some ideas to the Slovenian government, well, use us. We are a non-governmental organization. We are eager, we are really hungry to do something for our nation, for our state, and for Europe. So let's help each other together.